Hi, Leonardo Bonanni. I'm the founder and CEO of Sourcemap. Sourcemap is a startup I founded at the Media Lab and spun out in 2011, so 10 years ago. We're dedicated to helping multinational companies have completely traceable and transparent supply chains down to the raw materials as a way of tackling some of the biggest issues facing the world today, including deforestation and the social issues that underlie it. These days, you will hardly find a news cycle when you don't see a case being brought against some globally recognized brand regarding an issue facing its supply chain. And these issues are almost always in the first mile of the supply chain where the raw materials are being sourced, especially high risk agricultural raw materials that are made with risk of child labor, forced labor, or land use change issues like deforestation and incursion into protected areas. The fact that these sophisticated companies that have invested millions in their supply chain data to date still have very little control over the first mile of the supply chain is explained very simply. The first mile of the supply chain for many of the world's high-risk commodities is still being tracked using paper. At the very best, it might be tracked in a spreadsheet somewhere, but it's never managed in the cloud in a way that a brand that ultimately receives the raw material is able to act on data before a problem happens. As a result, most of the world's high-risk commodities are barely traceable to the farm, and of those which are traceable to the farm, very few of those transactions are verified, meaning the vast majority of high-risk agricultural commodities are traded in a way that obfuscates their origin and very likely creates a reputational risk for the ultimate customer. To tackle this problem, we've had to build a completely different kind of database, because whereas a typical supply chain has a few hundred, maybe a couple thousand suppliers in it, even for a multinational company, the reality is there are hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of producers in the first mile of a company's supply chain, between the farms and the mines that supply the raw materials. The only kind of database that works for this big of a group of suppliers is modeled on social networking. And so we've built a database that companies use to invite their known suppliers, and their known suppliers are then required to invite their suppliers who invite their suppliers. And within a matter of 6 to 12 weeks, a global multinational will have a good handle on its entire supply chain down to the raw materials and have established a communication channel, which allows them to keep that supply chain up to date and continue to collect data as various concerns arise. In many cases, Sourcemap is called in to digitize supply chains for the first time, and in places where a lot of data is still not in the internet. And so we've had to develop a series of tools, including very easy to use, very low bandwidth ERP style systems for buyers on the ground, and including offline mobile apps that are used to remotely audit farms, to map them, to register producers. In many cases, our customers quickly uncover a pretty glaring issue. This is an example of a footwear company that was able to cascade the social network invitations through its leather purchasing to discover that many of the slaughterhouses that were being used to process the beef had recently moved into areas of the Amazon where we were observing fires happening from satellite imagery. And that's what you see here. The purple represent the slaughterhouses and the red represents the pixels of fire observed by satellites. Faced with this kind of data on this kind of a scale and at this kind of a speed, companies are now emboldened to do a number of different things. For one, if a company has mapped its supply chain down to the raw material, they're able to stand up and compete much better for conscious consumers than others. And this is the example of one such brand that uses its extensive understanding of its end-to-end supply chain to publish a map and tell the story of how many precautions are taken at every tier, from the footwear all the way down to the trim and the glue and the rubber that makes the sole of the shoe. Every care they've taken to empower communities and to improve the environment in the supply chain. And they're able to share these maps and all the storytelling content that goes with them with the public. They're also able to make some very important choices that can have significant positive impact on a global scale. And this is the result of that same data I showed you earlier. Once apparel companies uncovered the practices that underlie much of their leather sourcing, they were able to implement a boycott to basically shift their sourcing to other sources. And that forced the hand of the government of Brazil in its permissiveness to land clearing fires in the Amazon and put a moratorium on those fires. And finally, if you're not doing it for competitive benefit and you're not doing it to change the world, you might just be doing it because it's going to become a requirement to do business. As more and more containers are being held at ports in the US by Customs and Border Protection on suspicion that they were made with slave labor. The only way that you can respond to these so-called withhold release orders issued by Customs and Border Protection is if you can produce a clear certificate of origin, which is to say that you've mapped the chain of custody of every single raw material in that container, and you can produce that report quickly enough that the material inside doesn't spoil. So whether you're doing it for legal reasons, you're doing it for reputation reasons, you're doing it to change the world, if you start mapping your supply chain today, you'll be in very good company. And these are just some of the multinationals that are using Sourcemap today to deal with some of the biggest risks and the biggest issues in their supply chain. And this is not being done at a small scale. This is being done on a global scale across the entire high-risk commodity portfolio that the companies rely on. So if there's something that keeps you up at night, or if you see a way that your business could gain an edge by being more transparent about the care you've taken to make your supply chain responsible, then don't hesitate to get in touch with us. We're working with companies all over these sectors and others, and we'll be happy to give you more of a demo. Thank you.